Welcome to live stream number 3 for us. I will see how long I can keep this counting up.
That's right. Until I run out of fingers, I'll be able to count.
Hey, well, welcome everyone. We're really excited to talk to you today about revenue. A little teaser. But first, if you're new here, because the group in general is still pretty new, if you're new, we do weekly live streams every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Central Time for us, whatever that time is for you. Welcome. Last week, we introduced the simple profit formula, and then this week and the next couple of weeks, we're going to go down the list of what that formula is and dive in deeper into each of those levers. So today, that means we're talking about revenue, and we're going to dive even further into pricing within revenue. We have a little sneak peek of a calculator to expand on last week's calculator about what the real impact of pricing is on profit. And so that'll be at the end. And then also at the end, we have some questions that have come up in the Facebook group over the last week. And so we have a Q&A, of a hold for Q&A at the end, get some of your questions answered. So that's what we got looking forward to today. Right? Are you ready, Colin? Should we recap our...
Yeah, I'd say I was born ready, but I was a little slow, but I'm ready now.
All right, yep. I'm going to remember how to share my screen, and we're going to do a very quick recap of the profit formula. And it's, I think, this one.
There we go.
Heyo. Okay, let's dive in. Remember what the simple profit formula is. First off, revenue. That's why today is the first topic.
That's right.
Yeah, so it all comes in with revenue. Obviously, the main and most important part of making any profit is that you make money in the first place. So the revenue is money coming in, and then you subtract out these different categories, which is cost of goods sold, anything that is required to, deliver your product or service, sales and marketing, labor, and the remaining is overhead. And then, so if you take revenue minus all those costs, you get profit.
Which is the best part of the whole formula. Yeah.
Yeah. And the reason why we have this simple profit formula, as Colin mentioned last week, is that you should be able to explain how your business makes money on the back of a napkin. That's why this is super simple. 5 categories.
And understanding these things as a percentage, right? That's one of the big keys. Not just the total amount you spent, but how that percentage relates to revenue and what goes up with revenue and what is fixed. So,
yes.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's where we were last week. Let's dive into revenue. Let's make some money, huh?
Yeah. So I love this. And, we kind of talked about the switching over as we're focusing on revenue. One of the things that, I talked a little bit about my story of originally being in a business that was struggling and I took it over and it was a turnaround. It was a big mess. And I'm sure we'll unpack elements of that big mess over time. But one of them that was really, kind of a wild element to starting the story was when I first took over that business, about 75% of the revenue of the company was not profitable. And I could prove it was not profitable. And essentially me taking over the company was by design, I was going to eliminate 75% of that revenue that we were doing.
Ooh,
and yeah.
And so
as everyone would imagine, right? You eliminate 75% of your revenue as a company, you got a big problem on your hands. So this, revenue is something I'm really passionate about because what I was essentially saying was that I had to rebuild the revenue to the extent that it would be back to being a profitable business and ultimately grow back to the size that it was. And then we've since grown to, 3 times the size that it originally was or whatever, 4 times. But the idea was when I eliminated it, I just kind of willy-nilly went at throwing everything I had, everything I could think of. Again, I was a young entrepreneur. I didn't have a lot of experience. I didn't have a framework like we're going to talk about here with the 5 levers. And so I just went and anything that looked like it would add more revenue of the kind that I wanted, we went after it. And so what's been so powerful through my experience over time and developing this framework of the 5 levers is that I can now have a strategy and tactics for each of the 5 levers. And I can ultimately determine, like, through what means am I going to grow my revenue? And so that's a big part of what we want to unpack today, and kind of how we arrived where we are.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this because this is the way that we think about revenue, all of the different pieces, all of the different avenues that you could bring money into the business is what we're about to talk about. So let us dive down into the list. The first one being, how are you bringing clients and customers in, which is new customer acquisition.
Exactly. So again, we'll go through and simply define these really quick, and then we'll kind of come back and talk about like the overall impact of them. But new customer acquisition, yeah, it's as simple as getting customers that you don't already have, right? And so that is one lever in and of itself. And the idea with the 5 levers is that any one of them could single-handedly solve your revenue problems in theory, right? You could just, with nothing else changing, I could just gain way more new customers and I could be golden and hit my target, right? But we'll kind of explain is how they all work together.
The second one, pricing.
Ooh, pricing. And you said we're going to dive into it deeper today. The pricing is a big one. So pricing is, there's an element to your existing customers and updoing or increasing pricing there. But then there's also how you're pricing your new customers that you're acquiring. But yeah, pricing is massive. Cannot overstate the significance of pricing.
Yeah, and it's not easy to adjust your pricing. So, I mean, we're not saying any of this is easy per se, but these are the levers that you can pull if you're trying to increase your revenue.
Yep.
Third one, and then again, we're going to come back and talk about them all together. Third one is customer profitability and mix. What does this mean?
Yeah. So customer profitability and mix. What we're really saying there is, who are you selling to? And, are they actually profitable? So if you're a small company, many small companies start out with this mentality of like, I'll sell anything to anybody who will buy it. And so we'll talk about here in a minute the other component, but one side of that equation is the anybody, right? Like, I'll sell anybody. I have big businesses as customers, small businesses, little mom and pops, like any different size customer, any different style of customer. And so once you get really good with your revenue is in part when you start identifying, and nowadays in the marketing world, it's talked about as like who's your customer avatar, right? Like who makes up that dream customer? What do they look like in terms of if it's, business to business or business to consumer? Like, what is that other person on the other side of the table if we're working out a deal? What makes them tick? And so we'll kind of talk about more of the details of it, but that's the basics of customer profitability.
And that you should be looking at, hopefully, your top customers are the ones that are most profitable for you.
100%.
That's the ideal world, but this is why we have it as one of the levers, because a lot of times this can fall by the wayside when you're looking at, well, how many new customers am I bringing in? All of the other levers. And so it can not be front of mind. Well, maybe your top customer is actually losing you money. That's an issue.
Been there. Yep.
So you want to be looking at, are your top customers the ones that are most profitable for you? If they're not, how do you move yourself along so that they are more profitable? And the other part of this with mix is when your top customer makes up so much of your business that you're really beholden to that customer, and that's risky. So like if your top customer is, I don't know, 20, 30, 40, 50% of your business, that becomes risky because if you lose them, what are you going to do? If they start negotiating terms for you, what are you going to do? You don't really have a good negotiating stance, or you're not in a good negotiating position of power when one client makes up so much of your business.
Yep.
So the number 4 is very related to number 3, and that's product profitability and mix. What do you want to add on this side?
Yeah. So I said, the statement was, when you're a typical small business, you have that mentality of I'll sell anything to anyone, right? So this is the anything element of that equation. And it's kind of like, if somebody's willing to pay for it, I have to offer it. And it's a really common trap small businesses fall into. And so we'll kind of talk through and figure out how to debunk some of the thinking that naturally leads all of us, again, been there, but leads us into thinking that that's a good idea at some point or time. And again, we'll talk about how these all interplay with each other. But that one is as simple as, do you know what your most profitable products are? Do you know which ones you make money on, which ones you lose money on, and why? And so that's diving deep into that topic.
Mm-hmm. I've seen this many times where as a CEO or an owner that you see, okay, well, if I sell this person this thing, that's money in the door. We need money in the door. So
Mm-hmm.
that is always good. And then what happens down the line, if you're not paying attention to the pricing or how much it's taking to fulfill that from even like a cost of goods sold or internal people, you could be bringing revenue in the door that's actually losing you money.
Yeah.
And so that's a big mindset
I've got to
shift.
stop saying been
That
there, because I've done every one of these things we say not to do. I've done every one of them, every single one. So just
yeah,
blanket
I mean,
statement from now on. I did that. I tried that. It didn't work.
we see it all the time where you get so focused on the cash coming in the door, but you have to be aware of what that's doing throughout the entire lifespan of that product or service.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a big one. And then last but definitely not least, client retention and repeat sales.
Yeah. And interestingly, a lot of times, so repeat, that could be churn if you're in a recurring type of business. So, I've got 10 clients this month. Next month, I'm only going to have 8 because I'm always churning out, a percentage of my clients. Or in a lot of businesses that are reoccurring, which I would define as same customer doing very steady repeat business. And then some businesses are just, as simple as like, I do business with a customer and it may be 6 months or a year or 2 years, or maybe never, and trying to understand which part of that it's going to be true. It's really raising repeat. And so recurring is repeat on autopilot in theory, unless you churn it out. Right. And so, but every other version is I'm doing everything within my power to make the best of the customer experience so they come back and want to buy again.
Yes.
And we'll talk about
Yeah,
here
so
in a minute how they all interact with each other. And that becomes a really, really kind of powerful theme, is that if the customer does not have a good experience frequently, you have a much harder time with repeat sales, which puts a lot more pressure on everything else.
Mm-hmm. And I hear all the time about it's much cheaper to keep a client than it is to get a new one. So that's why client retention is so important. Really, so at its core, these 5 levers are: who are you bringing in? What are you charging? And how many of those are you keeping around?
Yep.
If you
Yeah.
want to really.
Yeah. And you know me, like I coming from a manufacturing background, and just, I like, my brain almost looks at things like an assembly line kind of. And so, yes, it's the front end. These are not put together, to be clear. The 5 levers are not in order of significance. They're not in order of our favorites. They're kind of in a chronological order of how the business experiences them. And so you've got the front end, which is that, new customer acquisition, the pricing, which is kind of happening between the front, what we're charging new customers and what we're charging existing. The 3 and 4 is like the open orders, open customers, people we're dealing with, like what and who are we selling to? What does our existing business look like? And then 5 is like what's leaking out the back door. And so that's the way that this is designed to think about. And I would really highly encourage everyone to think about the levers in that way, because it really helps your mind kind of recognize a little more quickly, like, where is it working and where is it not? And that's a huge element of the five levers framework. Is again, when I was a young entrepreneur and I knew that I just eliminated 75% of the company's revenue, sliced off the revenue stream that was the dominant part of our business and took the smallest piece and said, I'm going to build it back up. I just threw everything I could. I didn't have a framework to be able to say, okay, is my problem related to new customer acquisition? Is it pricing? Is it et cetera, et cetera? I didn't have that framework. And so I just kind of was going in 100 different directions at once, trying everything that I thought might have an impact. And what gets really cool about business is we were talking with a client earlier today, like when you start getting into the logic and the kind of the nuts and bolts of what works, what doesn't, and then what are the questions we can't yet answer? So we dive deeper. Like that's when business gets really, really cool and you get really good.
Yeah. It's all about asking the next set of questions. Business is just asking the next set of questions,
Yep.
the next hurdle that you have to get past.
Yeah.
And so we're going to spend the next chunk of time diving into pricing because that's really our forte. It's the most,
Well, and
financy.
before we go there though, Rachel, I do want to talk about a couple
Yeah.
themes that I see frequently within these
Yeah.
5 levers. Okay. So, one of the things that's really common is, and you hear me say this all the time, I talk about it with clients, we talk about it with our business, we talk about it with, with friends of mine. If you have enough, what I call top of funnel. So number one, if you have enough interest in leads and prospects that you have the ability to acquire to acquire new customers, then you can have a stronger stance on pricing. You can take a harder line on which types of customers and which types of products. And then maybe you can get to a position where the people that you're lacking in retention with are the people you don't want to do business with anymore. That
Ooh,
is
that's a
what we
nice place
want
to
you to
be.
get to. That is the goal. And so any one of these elements working by themselves, any one of these levers could theoretically be strong enough. If every customer you'd ever done business with in the history of your business and you were a 20-year-old business were still a customer, then you wouldn't need to add them super quickly because everybody stayed, right? So you could be killing it on number 5 and maybe not even where you want to be on the other ones and still have a good business. And that's true for any one of these. But again, a theme that I've seen is that if new customer acquisition is strong, you become strong through 2, 3, and 4. And it's typically then that the right type of the business that you don't want anymore is leaving through number 5. If you do not have good customer acquisition, then you're very nervous. Every price increase is to an existing customer. And in your mind, you start focusing on like, what percentage of the business are they? And what if they went away? What if they got angry? You start going down this kind of thought process. And so one of the big breakthroughs with this, 5 levers framework is the mindset shift around like, if I could control these 5 levers, or even if I got where I was really good at 2 or 3 of these 5 levers, I could single-handedly, through this one area of revenue, change my entire business. And I could dramatically increase profitability. I could dramatically increase my experience, my team's experience, and ultimately my customer's experience. And that's big. I mean, that is a big, big thing. So that's a theme that I see is if number 1 is strong, oh my gosh, the sun's shining every day, like we're in great shape. And again, we're not diving deep into, but I mean, it means we have to be able to profitably acquire customers. This is not at all costs. I cannot spend $100,000 to acquire a $10,000 customer. But if I can reliably and profitably acquire customers, my life is on a different level than it is without.
It's a lot easier to go at your sales process with an abundance mindset. So you're not just feeling really, desperate when you're on sales calls, like, well, I need this client. You can really weigh out the options, say, this is an ideal client. Yes, we want them. This, not so much.
Yeah.
That might cause us more headaches down the road. When you have so much coming in through the top of funnel, you get to be a little choosier.
Yes.
And that puts you in such a good position of power when you're in the sales process, when you're negotiating something, when you're even fulfilling that product or service. When you have so much coming in, you can be like, you know what, that's not the right fit for us.
Yes, I love that. And so to that point, every one of these things can be either a type of filter or like a feedback loop. So in other words, to your exact point, if I have enough volume coming in the top, I can then be choosier in terms of like, well, the products I'm offering right now are this or this, or the types of companies or businesses that I'm looking to work with right now are this or this. I don't have to have this like anything that moves, I got to kill it and try and eat it mindset, which, for small businesses is very easy to fall into that trap. And like you said, we have to work our way out of it with an abundance mindset, but we also have to be strategic and thoughtful and intentional, right? And that's what I love about having a framework for how I look at that. And again, we've said, as will always be true, if you're watching this live stream, if you have another framework that works for you, that's great too. It's the idea is not that this is the end all be all. This is from my experience and my research and the way I like to look at a business. The most important thing is that you have a strategy, that you have a framework that you use, and that you have the right people around you to actually do something with this information, right? You don't want we've all walked out of like a big conference or seminar and we're like charged up and this is it, and then 2 weeks later, it's like, what did they say in that conference again? Like I've been back to real life, I don't have time for that anymore. So that's the biggest thing that I would always encourage people is like, have a framework, have a lens that you look at things through, and do something about it.
Yeah. Something you can stick to.
Absolutely. So so that's, we'll talk a lot about pricing, but again, pricing is that feedback loop. It's the ultimate leverage multiplier, I would say, on all of these, because if I've got the right pricing power, and we'll kind of talk about this. I know some of our questions from the group, which we'll get into later, related to dealing with big customers and the impact of having big customers and you being the little guy, right? When you can command a premium price, which I believe every business, we talked about this last time, I think a little bit, every business that's a small business, you cannot win on volume. You have to have a premium price. There is no other way. Mathematically speaking, you have to have a premium price. And so pricing is absolutely huge. We'll talk about it here in a minute, but it's the theme of good pricing. When I can command good pricing, my business is healthier through and through. My team is happier. I'm able to be a little more selective, like you said, about the right kinds of clients or the wrong kind of clients. It allows me to have the safety margin to make changes. Again, I had to go in crazy person style and just lop off 75% of revenue. Would not recommend that, by the way. Call me and let's talk about it. Just let's have a heart to heart about what that's going to really look like before you ever go through that, if you're actually thinking about something that drastic. But, if you have really strong pricing, then making a change with your customer mix or making a change, reinvesting in new customer acquisition to get more top of funnel, to give you more strength all the way down. All of those things become possible with strong pricing. And with weak, I've said this and I say it over and over again. I'm like a broken record on pricing. If your pricing is weak, you start cutting every conceivable corner. And the problem is some of those corners are fat. Some of those are things that you can cut and nobody complains and nobody notices, but then you keep going. You have to, because the low keeps eating at you and eating at you. And so pretty soon you're cutting corners. That means your customer experience suffers, your employee experience suffers, your quality of life suffers. You just start settling on every turn. And so, bad pricing, weak pricing is like a special form of torture that I wouldn't wish on anybody. It really is. So please, if you know that you're doing that, if you feel yourself doing that, just ask that question around like, what would a premium price in my market for my product, what would it have to look like? And now at least we're asking the question of what if? And at first you're not going to know how to do it. If it were super obvious, you would have already done it. But at least you're down that path that says, I will accomplish this one way or another. It's just a matter of when and how, not, and I get rid of if. If has to go away as a question on premium pricing.
Yeah. And we want you and your business to be competing for customers, clients based on the value you provide, not the price. So if the price is the determining factor between, well, I was going between you and this other people, but your price is better,
Yep.
that we want you to get away from that. We want them to instead say, wow, you provide so much more value to me that is why I'm going to choose you.
Yes. And I would argue that, that's really the experience that every successful business has, is that they have, and that's what differentiation is all about. And that's, again, a topic for another day, but they've essentially said, like, I can't be this apples and apples comparison. I have to break completely free of apples to apples and get into not even like apples and oranges, but I want to be, apple and whatever, the color yellow. Like, I want to be in my category of my own. And so anybody who likes apples, I am the brand, I am the go-to. And that's really what the best businesses in the world. And you can look at them, you can name any business you can think of right off the top of your head, the Nikes I'm wearing. That's what all of them have achieved. They have achieved that category of one. And again, we're not saying you just wake up one day and decide, I want to be a category of one. And so you are, but it starts with the confidence and the mindset shift that says, I can take a powerful approach to pricing. If I believe I can, I'm intentional about it. So that's what we want. That's what we want for you, for sure.
Yeah. Are you ready to dive into pricing?
Well, I do want to say a last trend. I'll tell another quick story. I want to tell the last trend that I see. And this is around customer profitability and mix and the product profitability and mix. When I talk about getting rid of 75% of my revenue, it was because we were selling the wrong type of product. That type of product, and it's a long story, so I won't bore everybody with it, but the gist of it is that I recognize that at any scale, we would never be profitable in this particular type of revenue. And I could see companies in our industry, big companies, that were just on this hamster wheel of 3 or 4 years. They would go big, go crazy on this type of revenue, and then they would shed it. And literally they'd sell the company or get acquired or just divest of the business. And this was happening over and over again in these kind of like big phases. And so once I recognized that about our industry and about we were just trying to be a tiny version of everybody else, I was like, no, there's 25% of our revenue that we're kind of a category of one, and nobody knows it and nobody thinks about it. But if we just woke up every day and focused on it, it would be life-changing. And that's exactly what we did and how I rebuilt the whole company. And so it was out of desperation of the failure and the risk that came with just trying to be the wrong thing every day. You run into 100 problems related to that. But that was the big aha. And so I would say if your customer, profitability and mix, and to give an example that might be a little more attainable or easy to understand for everybody, one of my businesses is a cabinet business. And so, for example, we have determined we sell this type of cabinet. There's residential, commercial, this style, that style, different manufacturing processes, all different types of forms and functions and uses, everything from like the IKEA off the shelf. You can get a 12 or an 18 or a 24-inch cabinet like at Home Depot or IKEA, up to like super, super custom, and everywhere in between. So we had to figure out what product makes sense for our talent, for our market, and where we could kind of offer it in a unique, valuable way. And then we had to go out and look at what type of home builders should we be selling to. And so it's where those two things overlap that you get the right mix of customer and product. And that's really your 3 and 4 mix. And so hopefully that example helps everybody see, like, it is really, they work independently, but it's where they align and that you can become a premium price. That's where business gets really, really good.
And it's just so important to have these almost long-term visionary brainstorming sessions, like with the first company where you shut down 75% of the revenue. That short term, not that fun, right? But you have to do
Worst
it.
day of my life. Yeah.
But you had to do it in order for the company to still be around today.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. I think the mindset of the entrepreneur, and as entrepreneurs, we know it's a roller coaster. We live the highs, we live the lows, But the best and most successful entrepreneurs kind of take the incremental gains of today, build them on again tomorrow, but never lose sight of that 3 to 5 to 10 year view of where I'm going to be. And so if you're watching this, if you're up, that's awesome. If you're down, I know that's horrible. But the reality is, no matter where you are, if you're putting one foot in front of the other and you're continuing to make those incremental gains, and as I always say, like no hero story ever involves the hero doing the same thing for 20 years in a row and finally it works. It is like, I learned something new. I got new people around me. I brought together this like A team as I grew as an entrepreneur. And then all of a sudden I broke through. And so, I would just encourage everybody to think of it that way. And to your point, you've got to make the right choice for today, but never lose sight of that 10-year vision.
Yeah. Is it time?
It's time. Let's do pricing.
Okay. We're going to dive into pricing. So we've got a couple of scenarios for you. Some of this is, we want to revisit what we talked about last week, which is the profit formula. Again, revenue minus cost of goods, sales, marketing, labor, overhead equals profit. So if this is your original, what's been going on already so far, maybe you're making 100 million, if only, $1 million in revenue and you're making 10K in profit. That's 1% profit, right? What we talked about last week is the power of revenue in driving profit growth. And so if you add 10% growth in revenue and the rest of some of these are fixed, some of these are variable. So for example, cost of goods sold, if you increase revenue, you're probably increasing your cost of goods sold because they go very hand in hand. Same with sales and marketing. So those inch up.
The percentages stay the same, right? But the total dollars are growing because revenue is growing. And to your point, the next two are fixed. So adding a little more revenue should have no impact on the cost.
Yep. And so since usually labor is your biggest piece of the pie of your expenses, since that's not going up with an incremental increase in revenue, that so much of that goes down to profit. So if you increase revenue by 10%, you can increase profit by 710%. It's wild. We talked about this last week. My mind is still blown every time I see these numbers.
Yeah, as we know, humans are not made to calculate the type of math involved, right? It's such simple math, but at the same time, it's just not like it doesn't make logical sense the way our brains work. Yeah.
Yeah. But so then the next scenario is, that's great. Hey, if you can do that, you should. However, let's talk about what it looks like if you just increase revenue through a pricing change. In that instance, your cost of goods is not going up. Your sales and marketing is not going up. So let's look at the same revenue, but if that revenue is coming from an increase in pricing alone. And this, again, this is where it just gets so wild, it's crazy.
Yep.
Same increase in revenue, 1,000% increase in profit, because 100% of that increased revenue is going straight to the bottom line because there's no additional costs associated.
Exactly. So, and as we talked about this, we really want to emphasize that the 5 levers framework of revenue are not all created equal. Okay. If you just said, Colin, if you could just magic wand and you can only help a business in one way, I would give you a price increase. And I would give you a price increase because we talked about the negative side of all the downward spiral of the impact on your team and your clients and your health and happiness and the goods and products that you sell. You start shortcutting, trying to shortcut like the quality of the material. You make 100 horrible trades. But if you get the virtuous cycle of a price that goes up and you want to be a little bit stingy and say, I'm not going to spend all of that money. I'm going to make sure that I reinvest that money. I'm going to think about it differently. It's unbelievable. I mean, as you're seeing here, to a business that was making 1% profit at $1 million. They simply did a 10% price increase, and suddenly they're an 18% profit business, from 1% to 18% by pulling one lever, 10% improvement. It's unbelievable. So it's something that, again, what we're trying to get through to you here, if you want the tool, and Rachel will talk about that, but just get this right in your mind, because it is not natural. It's not you who hasn't figured this out yet. It is not natural for our minds to think this way. We have to come up with that premium pricing strategy. And it just is a matter of how, again, like I said, not if, because once you see it this way and you realize like how profoundly impactful that would be on you, you've got to. And the crazy part is, everybody, you have big customers, you have small customers, everybody's like, I don't know if my customers would be able to handle that. I mean, let's take a look around at what's happened in the world in the past 2 or 3 years, right? When everybody was talking every single day about inflation a year ago, it was essentially price were going up by single digit percentages every single month after month after month. And unfortunately, a part of our society wasn't able to sustain that. And that's really, really tough. But you're paying customers who you are helping them make money. They can handle a 10% overall price increase. They just can. It's just a matter of how you roll it out, how you pitch it, how you make sure that your value, like you said, is good enough.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the really important part is to think about what opportunity you're missing out on because you haven't done your price increase in a little while.
Yes.
Or maybe it's been years and you've been doing the same prices. What could your business look like if you had been just slowly, incrementally upping your prices over time?
Yep.
Think about not only the impact to profit, think about like what the impact to your team would be, what your mental health would look like, the stability of your company. And when you think about it as an opportunity cost, that helps make it a lot more urgent. Like, we got to be doing this now.
Yes. And we talked last week, one of the questions in the group last week was about how to figure out your marketing budget. So I just want to touch on that again. If you gave me the ability to pull this pricing lever, one of the very first things I would do is I might still invest, in our other model with the forecast, you're spending an extra $9,000 in sales and marketing in that middle column. I might say, you know what, I don't need 18% today. I'm going to still spend that $9,000. I'm going to put it back into sales and marketing. And I'm going to talk to my sales and marketing people, and I'm going to say, my goal is to invest enough out of our price increase to put enough pressure on the top of the funnel that we can keep increasing prices in the future. That is the virtuous cycle I want to be part of. And that's really the way I look at it is, hey, if your business can handle 10 new customers a month and you're currently getting 10, let's just say, if you invested more in sales and marketing and raised your prices, if you just raised your prices with your current model, maybe you only land 6 or 7 of those clients. Might still argue that's a better idea, by the way. But what if you could just invest a little bit of that additional revenue in sales and marketing and get back to where you're bringing on 10 new customers at a new price point? Life changes. Life changes. So yes, it's just, think about the math, understand what premium looks like, and then really just have that mindset breakthrough that like you have to do this one way or another.
Oh, it's so powerful. Such a big impact. If you take anything away from today's is that make a plan for your pricing. Like, at least just look at when's the last time I increased my pricing.
Yep.
Take a peek.
Yeah.
Let's see.
And again, as we said, customer profitability and mix, well, impacting that customer profitability is the revenue you're charging. So if you kind of go back to that 5 levers, your perfect scenario is that you're bringing in very high paying new customers at a maximum rate that you could handle. Your prices are just low of obscene. Think Nike, Apple, all the companies that we all spend money with, who you're like, wow, that's expensive, but I'm going to pay it anyway. Like that should be your ultimate goal that you're working toward. And if you said my biggest customers are also my most profitable, and I don't have one giant customer, I have a whole stable of my A customers, and they're also my most profitable. And then you said the same thing with your products. The products I sell the most of are the easiest to do and the most profitable. And I only lose people out the bottom that I don't really love and need to work with anymore. And so if you were in that mode, you would be Apple, right? You would be these businesses that we look at, and they have figured out how to get there on every one of those levels. We're not going to get on every one of those levels as a small business, and certainly not soon, but that's the journey. You should see that as truly, truly possible in your market, and not just say like, well, this is just who I am. This is just the way we have to do it, and keep, rocking the old story in your mind. You have to have that mental shift.
Yeah. It's good. It's good. Hey, I want to make sure that we have some time for our Q&A. We've got several questions on a different topic. So we're going to switch gears, take off your pricing hat, take off your revenue hat, put on your cash flow hat, because that's all of the questions that we got. I'm going to stop sharing, and we're going to read some of the questions that we got over the last week. This first one from Tara is about having those big customers. So if you have a client customer that makes up a big percentage of your business and they're pushing terms. So her question is, how do other businesses handle net term changes?
Yeah.
For example,
okay, go ahead.
For example, a major client that makes your business healthy margin annually wants to change net terms from 30 days to 60 days. What challenges does that create financially for other businesses? What other businesses do to make up the money that essentially is being extended to collect? It's a good question.
No, and that's a sophisticated question, because if you'll notice what she put at the end, that's the first breakthrough awareness for people to have, is that taking longer to collect costs you money. One way or another, no matter how you slice it, it raises the possibility they're not going to pay you at all, which is obviously risk and bad debt. You sometimes have to finance that cost. You have to spend additional time to try and chase it. I mean, there's multiple ways that it costs you money. So that's big. I wish on a lot of these cash flow questions that there was I had some magic fairy dust that I could sprinkle and it would solve everyone's problems. The reality is that when your business is built around a handful of large customers, it is incredibly hard to move the needle in terms of that type of relationship. And so what I would advise is thinking in terms of, are you dealing with enterprise type companies, which is, $1 billion Fortune 500 type companies, or are you dealing with small to mid-sized companies that just happen to be a really big customer for you? And really the reason to think that through is that it's just about an appeal to them. It is about having a heart to heart with that customer and saying, hey, I'm a smaller business. We've been really working our butt off to try and shine for you and keep you happy and make sure that you love what you're doing with us. This really impacts me on cash flow. And is there any wiggle room? So you go from a term being dictated to now we're at least in some light version of a negotiation here. And your ability to push is going to be very directly related to how many other options they have and how much you can afford to get a bad answer, right? And that's true on a lot of these cash flow issues. We'll talk about, I think there's another question that'll directly tee up talking about financing the interim. But as we look at, what does it mean to be pushed around? It really is about who has the leverage, unfortunately. And Walmart is infamous for that. I'm gonna pick on Walmart. They're not a client of ours. Probably won't be, I'm guessing. But, Walmart is notorious for that. I mean, they basically beat up their vendors to the point they have them on like some sort of a Walmart life support where I can't live with Walmart. I barely get by with Walmart, but I'm dead without them. And so then it's like, well, we're going to pay you on these terms and you're going to own the stock on our shelves. And like, they just keep grinding you and grinding you. And so if at all possible, avoid having a Walmart type as a customer. If it's not possible based on your market, is really just comes down to trying to have that real heart to heart and making sure that it's understood that, like, look, ultimately somehow this has to be either, Mr. Customer, impacting your price or your experience of working with me. And it's not just
Mm.
me, it will be true of anybody else that you try to buy from who you impose these terms on. It's very hard for a company like us to do well with that. And so I just wanted to open the conversation about what options. I've had amazing experiences just telling people, reminding them we're a small business. Like,
Mm.
I need you to pay me. I'm a small business. Like, I've got payroll, you know, we run a company that's profitable on paper, but it's not if you don't pay me. And it's
Mm.
amazing, you know, if you're really willing to have that like heart to heart type conversation, a lot of customers will say, okay, well, you know, the higher ups are pressuring me to get every vendor on these terms, but let me call down to the, you know, the AP office and see what I can do. And I've had
Mhm.
that work and be magical. So
Yeah. And just making it feel more human, humanizing the conversation. It's not we're just not talking between business and business. Like, hey, we're a small business. This has impacts. Getting them to see that
yeah, I love
does.
that. And I love one of those you just reminded me. One of them I love is like, I'll call somebody up. This means nothing, but I'll say, can I just ask you something off the record real quick? And it's such like a weird pattern interrupt for people that they're kind of like, okay, they almost like don't know where this is going. Like, are you going to ask me some sort of personal question or something? But it's almost like, could we take our role and our titles off for just a second?
Mhm.
And let me just ask you to me, like, what is this? Like, is there a way? And it just adds a depth to that relationship in a more corporate environment that you just don't get very often. And a lot of people
Mm.
really just respect your willingness to ask. And they're like, oh, yeah, we push those terms on everybody. But I mean, if you push back hard, or if I go tell, you know, the higher ups that you're a really valued supplier, then we'll relax it. And the worst case scenario, if you handle it tactfully, worst
Yeah.
case scenario is you're just right back where you started. So at least you know where there was pushback and where there might not have been.
Mhm. And then, hopefully that all works for you, and, you've said that's happened to you many times where it's worked. If it doesn't, then it's something that you know that you need to have more cash in the bank to handle the longer payment terms. What else would you say, Colin?
Yeah, I mean, you need some sort of a lending facility. And this is we haven't really talked a lot about the specifics of business models as I describe them, but it's really like, what is your revenue model? What is your cash model? What is your labor model? And these are dependent on, like, for example, what I'm saying is, if you're a manufacturer, you have a version of each of those things I just mentioned. Or if you're a services company, you have a version of those things. So it's very heavily dependent on what type of business model you're in. But in general, if depending on your cash flow model, you need cash in the bank. And to the extent that you're nervous about ability to have cash in the bank, you need a lending facility, some sort of line of credit, something. And, you know, we'll talk about that here in a second, but it's really important that you have the right type of lending for the right type of use.
Mhm. That does tie in next to our next question from Nicholas. It says, if your business has retainer payments and you have late payments from the client, what options can you look at if you know that this will happen often,
Mhm.
other than having money in the bank? So that's exactly what you're just talking about.
Yeah, so I would say that, you know, number one, if by retainer we're talking about some sort of a ongoing recurring, I'm a big believer that anyone who can commit to an ongoing recurring can commit to an ongoing credit card payment, an ongoing ACH payment, preferably. So, in other words, if people are committing to things that they can't afford to pay for, that's a huge red flag. If they can afford to pay for them, then we say, hey, great, you know, thank you so much, Mr. Client. That's going to be, you know, $1,000 a month. We're going to go ahead and submit the ACH information. If you could just provide us with the banking details. And so whatever that is, it's just, you make it a very matter of fact part of your business. if somebody's pushing heavily back on that, I would go back to our whole conversation. If you've got enough new clients, the types of clients who don't pay you are the types who should go down out the back door. And it may not be plan A this week, but if I set a end of 2024 goal or an end of whatever period of time goal and say, this is part of my goal is to build a business where I can have that hard line and just have that conversation. It's like, hey, you know what? The thing about my business is that I love working with you and I really want to help you, but my employees are uncomfortable with IOUs on their paychecks. And so I can't, right? And so I'm being a little bit blunt and a little bit harsh, but I'm also connecting the dots for the customer who thinks of me as this business that isn't a real reflection of human. And I'm kind of tying it to like, well, I'm sorry, that doesn't actually work in my world. And so I hired the employees, they did the work, we got to payday, they've got to be paid. And that's true of vendors, that's true of employees, that's true of my rent, that's true of anything. So I think just being willing to have a little bit of that hard conversation. And then it comes back to, you know, if you have a line of credit, if you have money in the bank, you know, I know the question was besides money in the bank. Unfortunately, the only other alternative is don't have those type of clients or have a way to borrow money to supplement the cash in the bank. And the quick statement on that is the right money tied to the right use. So in other words, people, please do not live off your credit cards. You can go find 100 success stories of some super rich, famous person who's like, I lived off credit cards and that's how I showed my commitment and that's why I'm here. Please don't do that. Do not do that. We don't want to be that kind of success story. If a bank says they can't lend you money, that is a red flag that your business should not be extending credit that you can't afford to extend. So it's like, think about, I'm unable to arrive at that type of financing. It's a sign that I shouldn't be offering that type of financing. And that needs to get turned back to the customer and look at it that way. And so just think about that in your business. If you're running a very profitable business and cash is just really lumpy, that's what a line of credit is for.
Yeah. So line of credit, preferable to credit cards. I'm guessing that's because of interest rates.
Oh, I love credit cards. I love them. They're great for airline miles and cash back. And they get paid 100% every month with money I already had in the bank. That is the only acceptable scenario for credit cards in my mind. There is no exception to that rule. And believe me, as a guy who, when I came into my first company, we had a 6-figure credit card bill we couldn't pay. So I know from having lived it, when that logic goes wrong, how bad it can hurt. And what we needed was a 6-figure line of credit.
Yep. Gotcha. Okay, we have one more question from Nate. Says about cash flow management and strategy. I own a manufacturing company and I feel I'm constantly being leveraged by larger companies and vendors in terms of payment terms. What is your advice in dealing with vendor terms at net 15 or 30 and customer terms at net 30 or 60 plus? Depending on lead times and shipment schedules, our cash cycle can sometimes exceed 3 to 6 months. So that's where your vendors are requesting payment on a shorter schedule than your customers are paying you.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we were really looking at the whole cash flow cycle, in part, you know, the customer gives you an order. They're always happy for you to get to work, right? Which is code for spending money. And then you have to get something from your vendor, and then the vendor wants to be paid that day forward, X number of days. And then it really is a game of how fast can I move it through my facility or my services so that it goes to my customer so I can start the clock. And to Nate's point, if the front end calendar is much shorter than the back end, plus there's a gap in the middle, ouch. And then I would even argue that a lot of those customers that are big and squeeze you for bad terms also don't pay on time, which is just a lovely little insult to injury on top of it. The hard part is you have to have leverage in this life, and that's really the only solution. And so leverage could be size. In this case, the two companies, you're stuck in between. I call this kind of the big squeeze. Like you're squeezed in between big vendors, big customers. you have to have some form of leverage. And so with your vendors, you've got to figure out how to get more alternative options for who to buy from. You just have to. And you need to go into those new vendors with a hardline conversation around the terms that you're willing to accept, the prices that you need to be at. And if you had that type of leverage, then you would at least be able to work on one side of the equation. On the customer side of the equation, because by and large, we occasionally all buy from a big company and they have that leverage. But most of what I think we're probably going to talk about in this group is people who are selling to bigger customers than their own company. And so if you can't have the size leverage, you need the specialization leverage. You need we've got the secret sauce to help you solve this problem type of leverage. Or you have relationship leverage, which is what we were talking about a minute ago, which is just like, I've got this heart to heart. The buyer understands where I'm coming from. They're willing to work with me. And I would argue that the bigger the title in your company, so if Nate's a CEO, that's a lot better than a head of purchasing to have that heart-to-heart conversation. But it should be this off the record. Can I take my CEO hat off and we just have a conversation as people? And when you execute it that way is the best chance of it working. But unfortunately, when you're sandwiched like that, there is no fairy dust that solves that problem for you.
Lots of good questions this week, all
Really?
around the same theme. That was very convenient of you all. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And hey, I always raise my hand. I've had unbelievably bad cash flow problems in my first company when I first took it over. So by no means, I know we're working our way through the profit formula, and I think we're going to continue on that path for the next few weeks, but cash flow is near and dear to my heart. And I have tried every different way to solve that problem. And I wish I could tell everybody there's some silver bullet, thread every needle solution. But the reality is it's a grind and you've got to stay on top of it. Someone you're working with has to be very, very focused on cash. And it's the faster I can receive from my customers, the slower I can pay my vendors, the more predictably I can anticipate my overhead and get a good enough margin. It's all of those things kind of working in unison and sometimes working against each other. And so I would just highly recommend you need the right people involved to help you keep an eye on that very, very closely.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you guys have more questions, we are going to, like Colin said, we're going to continue going through the profit formula. So next week would be COGS, or cost of goods sold. But we want to keep space at the end of these live streams for Q&As. If it's not related to COGS, that's fine. So send us your questions, keep sending us your questions, and we will make a space for them. All right. Well, that's our whole live stream for this week.
We did
a lot to cover.
I need a nap. It was like a really good nap.
We're excited to keep going through the profit formula. This is, a passion of ours. So tune in next week, 2 p.m. Central on Wednesday, and we will see you then. Thank you all for watching. Bye.